He thought it was just a wooden box drifting on the water. But when the fisherman got closer and realized it was a coffin, his heart dropped. And what was inside turned an ordinary day into a real nightmare. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The first light of dawn always came quietly in the small coastal town where Elias lived. It did not burst through the night like a triumph, but rather crept in slowly, bringing with it a soft gray glow that blurred the horizon and made the sea and sky nearly indistinguishable. The world, at that hour, felt peaceful in a way that would not last. It was a moment suspended between darkness and the noise of daytime life that would soon take over the harbor. Elias Rowe cherished that fragile calm. For him, the early hours were the only time when the ocean felt like his alone, and he understood the rhythms of its breathing as if it were a living thing he had known all his life. The wooden planks of the pier creaked under his boots as he walked toward his boat. The vessel was not much to look at. A modest craft, worn by years of salt and storms, patched and repainted several times, with a motor that coughed awake each morning like an old man complaining about his bones. But it was his, and that mattered more than its condition. Elias ran a hand along the gunwale as though greeting a familiar friend. The paint peeled beneath his fingers in thin, curled flakes. Beneath all the imperfections was a dependable core. It had weathered more hardship at sea than most boats in this part of the coast. A faint wind carried the familiar scent of salt and fish, mixed with the heavy odor of algae-covered ropes drying after yesterday's journeys. Over by the fish processing plant, seagulls squawked impatiently as workers unloaded crates of yesterday's catch. Their shrill cries echoed across the harbor, but out on the water, where Elias soon would be, those sounds grew faint and distant. He preferred that. The world felt simpler when he was away from other people. He moved with quiet efficiency as he prepared for another day of fishing. His hands worked automatically, checking the nets for tiers, examining the lines, ensuring he had enough fuel. It was a practiced ritual. Fishing was not a job one could approach without respect for the countless little tasks that kept a man and his boat alive. Elias had learned that lesson young. Life near the ocean demanded humility and constant attention. A moment's carelessness, a small oversight, could cost everything. Under the dim light, his expression seemed carved from stone. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with a face weathered by long hours under the sun and a life that had given him more troubles than blessings. His skin was dark, warmed by the sun's relentless gaze, and his eyes sharp and cautious, always watching the environment around him. He was one of the few black fishermen in the region, which had earned him more stares than friends. Most of the townspeople were polite enough, but a lifetime of being treated like an outsider had taught him not to expect much from others. He did not complain. Not out loud, nor in his thoughts. Hardship was something he had grown to accept as a constant companion. He owed money to the owner of the local fish market, a debt that gnawed at him more viciously with each passing week. A poor season meant trouble, and trouble always came faster for men like him. The numbers never quite worked in his favor, no matter how early he rose or how long he stayed out on the water. Debt was a quiet monster, waiting in the shadows of every sunrise. The sky brightened, turning from charcoal to washed-out blue as the sun stretched its reach across the horizon. Elias untied the mooring ropes and stepped gracefully into his boat, the boards beneath his boots rocking slightly as if the vessel recognized its master. He took a moment to breathe in the cold morning air, then started the motor. It sputtered before roaring to life, sending vibrations through his hands, up his arms, and into the place in his chest where nerves and determination lived side by side. He guided the boat away from the pier, the wake spreading behind him like a restless ribbon on the water's surface. The town receded quickly. The colorful facades of houses lining the coast blurred into soft shapes. Even the tallest buildings looked humble compared to the vast openness of the sea. Out here, nothing was certain except the unpredictable will of nature. Elias tilted his head slightly upward, letting the breeze cool his face. On mornings like this, the ocean did not feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. He watched the birds circle overhead, their wings slicing the air with a grace he envied. A dolphin briefly surfaced nearby, its sleek body catching the morning light before disappearing again beneath the waves. Elias allowed himself a rare smile. There were still small wonders left in the world, reminders that not everything was struggle. The sea was full of beauty, but it demanded patience and respect. Elias had both, more than most. The boat cut through the water toward his usual fishing grounds, a familiar stretch a few miles offshore where the seafloor dipped into shadow and the fish tended to gather. He felt a cautious optimism. If fortune favored him today, he could haul enough to reduce at least a portion of that debt weighing on his mind. He imagined arriving back at the dock with crates full of shimmering fish, imagined the skeptical glance from the market owner replaced by a nod of reluctant approval. Elias did not need gratitude, only fairness. A good catch could buy him a little more time and a little more air to breathe. But as he traveled further from the coast, a strange sensation tugged at his focus. Something in the atmosphere felt off. The ocean was too quiet. The wind that usually brought playful ripples across the surface seemed to hesitate, as though unsure of its direction. The sky, though brightening, looked oddly dull and muted. Fog clung to the edges of the horizon, thickening instead of fading. Elias frowned. He glanced behind him, making sure he could still see faint outlines of land. They were there, but only barely. He told himself it was nothing. The sea had moods, just as people did. He had sailed in far worse conditions and emerged unscathed. A fisherman could not afford to be frightened by every shift in the air. Still, the unease lingered, coiling around his thoughts like a gentle warning. The ocean, for all its beauty, always held secrets beneath its surface, some better left undiscovered. Elias pushed the feeling away and focused on his work. He checked his lines again, adjusted the throttle, and let his senses attune to the rhythm of the boat. Routine calmed him. Out here, repetition was a shield against fear. But the quiet persisted, growing heavier the farther he traveled. Even the gulls had abandoned their patrol above him, turning back toward shore as if they, too, sensed something amiss. He slowed the engine as he approached his chosen spot. The water below darkened, indicating deeper depths rich with marine life. Elias prepared his gear, his movement steady, though the hair at the back of his neck prickled with a tension he could not name. He inhaled deeply and steadied himself. This was no time to be superstitious. He had a job to do, and responsibilities that did not disappear simply because the ocean seemed strange today. With one last glance across the quiet expanse, he cast his line into the water. The ripples spread outward, distorting the reflection of the sky above. Elias leaned on the side of the boat, staring down into that shifting image, wondering if perhaps the silence was a blessing rather than a warning. A chance to fish without distraction. A moment of peace before the day's challenges returned to remind him of his place in the world. He adjusted his stance and waited, his eyes drifting toward the edge of the fog. Something about that vague white curtain unsettled him more than the silence ever could. It looked as though the sea were hiding something behind a veil that was just thick enough to keep out the truth. The thought crossed his mind only briefly, but its presence lingered, like a whisper he could not quite hear. The sun climbed higher, blossoming into a warm, golden shape breaking through the mist. Under normal circumstances, that light would have filled Elias with warmth, but today the brightness revealed something unexpected in the distance, an object floating on the surface of the water, its silhouette stark against the glowing haze. It was too large to be debris, too still to be a living creature. Elias narrowed his eyes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The object drifted slightly, turning slow and deliberate as if guided by an unseen force. For a moment, Elias thought it might be a section of a broken wooden dock, or perhaps the overturned hull of a small boat. The shape, however, was wrong. It was too symmetrical, too clean-cut, rectangular, long. Its corners were sharp, not curved. It did not belong there. He straightened, his heart giving a single heavy thump in his chest. His breathing slowed as he watched the mysterious form move with the gentle swell of the waves. The fog around it seemed to stretch wide in a circle, almost as if keeping its distance. Elias wiped the back of his hand across his brow, though no sweat had formed there yet. His instincts, those invaluable instincts refined through years on the water, whispered to him that whatever he was looking at was no ordinary flotsam. The sea remained calm, unnervingly so. The waves did not push the object toward him or away. They merely supported its presence, cradling it softly like a mother with a child. But the shape continued to drift closer, betraying its size. It was far bigger than he had first imagined, long enough to hold a person, broad enough to be heavy, yet it floated easily atop the water as though made for the sea despite its unnatural design. The familiar world of fishing, of nets and tides and patient waiting, felt suspended around him. Elias swallowed hard. He could not understand why, but he suddenly knew that this morning, that was supposed to be like all the others, had just shifted into something entirely different. The calm he had felt only minutes earlier evaporated. The silent ocean did not seem peaceful anymore. It felt watchful, expectant. Elias reached for the throttle. His fingers trembled slightly, betraying the first tendrils of fear. He could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in around him. Something waited in that drifting shape, something not meant to be found. And yet, he knew he would go to it. How could he not? The ocean had brought it to him. The boat began to move, carving a path toward the ominous silhouette. The ripples in the water shimmered like silver threads, stretching outward as though marking the beginning of a journey he could not turn away from. Elias clenched his jaw and focused forward, eyes fixed on the object ahead. He felt the tightening in his chest, a wordless warning rising with each crank of the propeller. This day would not be ordinary, not anymore. The floating shape awaited him in the fog, silent and inevitable. Elias kept his eyes fixed on the long, rectangular silhouette as it drifted in the stillness of the morning sea. His boat crept closer through the thin curtain of mist that clung to the surface of the water, like a veil determined to hide the truth of what lay ahead. The soft hum of the motor sounded too loud in such unnatural quiet, as if the ocean itself warned him to turn back. But he was already committed to this course, pulled forward by a combination of curiosity, duty, and a strange, unsettling instinct that told him this discovery would not let him go even if he tried to escape. The shape grew clearer with every passing second. The edges were sharp, not worn down like driftwood or softened by the sea. It floated too evenly to be debris. It appeared deliberate, made, constructed. Elias slowed the engine as he approached, and the water around him seemed to grow heavy with anticipation, the ripples no longer playful but cautious. He reached out with the long wooden boat hook that leaned against the railing and extended it toward the object. As the hook gently bumped it, the surface gave a dull, hollow thud that vibrated through the pole and into his hand. The sound was unmistakable. Wood. Thick, solid wood. He set the hook aside for a moment, staring down at his find. It was a coffin. There was no denying it now. The sleek black finish reflected what little light broke through the fog, and the brass fittings adorning the corners were still polished enough to catch a faint gleam. This was not something that had been floating at sea for long. It looked almost new, as though someone had only recently consigned it to the water. But who would place a coffin here, adrift far from any burial grounds or grieving loved ones? And more importantly, why? The closer Elias looked, the more disturbing details he noticed. Thick metal clamps secured the lid shut, the kind of industrial hardware that had no place on a traditional coffin. These were not decorative fittings, but restraints, designed to keep the lid closed under pressure. Beneath the coffin, bound by waterproof straps, were cylindrical flotation devices. He leaned farther over the side of his boat, squinting into the cold water. The devices looked like durable industrial buoyancy tanks, meant to ensure that the coffin did not sink. Someone had gone through the great effort to ensure that this coffin stayed afloat. This was not a burial. This was transportation. He placed the hook carefully under one of the handles and guided the coffin closer. The wood was smooth beneath his fingertips when he reached down to steady it. The lacquered surface felt chillingly cold, as though it had been submerged in icy water for days, yet it showed no signs of wear. No algae, no barnacles, not even salt residue. It should have looked like something abandoned long ago. Instead, it looked like something freshly discarded, as if its journey across the water had only begun that morning. Elias felt a pressure in his chest, not from fear exactly, but from a deep and instinctive understanding that what he had found was not something meant for his eyes. The sea often gave up secrets, but rarely ones wrapped in such mystery. He took a long breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his mind. Logic told him he should pull away, pretend he never saw this, and go back to his fishing. But he knew he couldn't. Something in him would not allow it. Maybe it was a sense of responsibility. Maybe it was the unspoken rule of the sea. If something or someone was lost out here and you found them, you had a duty to see it through. Summoning his strength, Elias carefully maneuvered the coffin toward the stern of his boat. He decided that lifting it entirely aboard would be risky, both for his balance and the boat's stability. Instead, he lodged the coffin firmly against the edge, using rope to secure it so it wouldn't slip away. Once the knots were tied, Elias paused again and studied the strange marks he had noticed earlier. Long scratches carved a desperate path across the lacquered surface. They ran erratically in every direction, as though someone inside had fought with frantic, exhausting vigor to escape an impossible prison. His breath caught in his throat. It was one thing to find a coffin. It was another to find one that told a story of terror from the outside. And yet, this one seemed to scream from within, each scratch a cry for help carved into the wood. The idea that the coffin might contain something or someone beyond a peaceful corpse made the air around him feel suddenly colder. His fingers hesitated at the edge of one of the clamps. He tested it lightly and found it secure, designed to hold the lid in a sealed lock. The hardware looked expensive, far more so than the sort found in local funeral homes. The clamps were not designed to break easily, but something had caused one of the flotation tanks to come loose, and the resulting shift must have weakened the coffin's seal. Elias nudged the lid again, more out of caution than intent, and the lid shifted almost imperceptibly. There was a soft sigh of escaping air, like a whisper rising from the coffin's depths. Elias recoiled slightly, heart pounding against the inside of his ribs. He waited, listening. The sea remained silent. No eerie sounds echoed from within the coffin, no sudden motion, just stillness. And yet, that tiny shift had been enough to tell him that the coffin was not sealed as tightly as it once had been. Something inside had caused the balance to shift, and the clamps, once so secure, were now strained. This discovery had already been tampered with by the sea. He tried to steady his breathing. He knew what he needed to do next. The law of the sea was unspoken but ingrained deeply. If a body was found, it must be recovered. The dead deserved dignity. But this situation was different. Nothing about this coffin suggested a respectful burial. Every detail told Elias that this was a secret meant to disappear beneath the waves, not to be found by a fisherman on a quiet morning. He pulled himself upright and looked around the fog-shrouded water, half expecting someone to appear and claim the coffin. But he was alone, utterly alone, surrounded by endless gray emptiness. The town was nowhere in sight. The sea seemed to stretch into infinity. His mind tried to cling to normalcy. He thought briefly of his debts, his financial struggles, the day he had anticipated, simple, quiet, productive. But all those thoughts now felt like distant memories. Reality had shifted. Whether he wanted it or not, this coffin had chosen him. And though he tried to push away the fear stirring deep inside, it was impossible to ignore the truth that surrounded him like the fog. He reached again for the clamps. The cold metal made him shiver. He hesitated once more before gripping them firmly. If there was someone inside who needed help, if there was even the slightest chance that this coffin had been a prison rather than a tomb, then he owed it to them to look, to confirm, to understand. The alternative, leaving this object to drift aimlessly or sink beneath the waves, felt like a betrayal of what little humanity the sea allowed its sailors to keep. The metal resisted at first, but with a second attempt, the clamp released with a sharp click. The sound startled him, loud and jarring in the thick silence. He waited, forcing himself to breathe evenly, expecting something, anything, to happen. But again, the world remained perfectly still. He unlocked the second clamp, then the third. Each one gave way with the same mechanical finality. When the last clamp was undone, the lid shifted enough that he could see a thin line of darkness opening along the edge. It looked like the mouth of a sleeping creature, waiting to speak. Elias placed both hands on the lid, and for a moment he did not move. His heart pounded, telling him that whatever lay inside would change everything. That once he opened this coffin, he could never go back to the man he had been that morning, a man concerned only with fish and debt and the ordinary troubles of living. He pressed upward slowly. The hinges creaked in protest, the sound slicing through the stillness like the first scream in a silent nightmare. The lid rose an inch, then two. Elias leaned forward and looked inside, his eyes needing a moment to adjust to the shadowed interior. He expected the peaceful stillness of death. He did not expect what he saw. For the briefest second, he could not breathe. His chest constricted with shock so intense it paralyzed him. The coffin's occupant lay motionless, but the sight itself made Elias's skin crawl. A man, dressed in a tailored suit far too fine for the sea, his skin pale and stretched unnaturally tight, his wrists bound with heavy iron chains that secured him to the interior walls like a prisoner from some medieval dungeon. His face was frozen in an expression that showed his final moments had been filled with terror, not rest. But what struck Elias even harder were the marks on the inside of the lid, deep gouges torn into the wood from the inside out, fingernail fragments embedded in the grooves. It was impossible to look away. This man had fought. He had tried desperately to escape whatever fate had sealed him inside, and no one had listened. No one had helped. Until now, too late. Elias staggered back, gripping the edge of his boat to keep from losing his balance. The reality of the scene struck with full force. This man had not been dead when he was placed in the coffin. He had died trapped, suffocating slowly in a terrifying prison afloat on the sea. There was more. Something metallic glinted near the man's legs. A large case, strapped securely inside the coffin, its edges perfectly straight, its exterior unmarked. It didn't belong to a corpse. It belonged to someone who needed to keep something hidden. Elias found himself staring at it, unable to look away, sensing that whatever lay inside that case was the true purpose of this horrific burial. That case was meant to be transported across the water without suspicion. The body was merely the disguise, a ghastly, inhuman camouflage. The sea breeze brushed against Elias's face, snapping him back into himself. He swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of fear on his tongue. He could not leave this as it was. He could not pretend he hadn't seen it. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide this coffin here, but events had gone wrong. The sea had betrayed the criminals, delivering their secret into Elias's hands. And now he held the truth, a truth that could drown him, figuratively or perhaps literally. He closed the coffin lid gently, as though afraid of disturbing the dead. His hands lingered on the polished wood. A shiver ran through him despite the warmth of the rising sun. The air seemed to tighten around him, the world shrinking to the small space of his boat and the weight of his discovery. Elias straightened slowly, every muscle tense. He tied down the lid again, not to hide it from himself, but to protect what needed to be brought back to shore. His thoughts raced with questions that had no immediate answers. Who was this man? Why had he been chained? What was inside that case? And most importantly, would the people responsible for this come looking for their lost cargo? He looked out across the water again. Nothing disturbed the horizon. But Elias suddenly felt watched, even though he saw no one. He was far from help, far from safety, with only the sea as witness. The day had only begun, but Elias already understood one thing with perfect clarity. He was no longer alone out here. For a long moment, Elias simply stood there, staring at the coffin as though it were something alive, something capable of rising and striking back. The lid was once again closed, the clamps fastened just tightly enough to keep it from shifting with the rocking of the waves, but not like before. Not as the people who sealed that man inside had intended. The coffin's secret had spilled into the open, exposing its horror to the morning air and leaving Elias with a knowledge he would have given much to unlearn. The salt wind brushed against his skin, cold and sharp as if encouraging him to keep moving, to break the spell that had frozen him in place. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, trying to steady the fear coiling in his stomach. Panic would not help him now, nor would pretending this was just some bizarre accident. Nothing about the coffin suggested chance or misfortune. It had been deliberately prepared, locked, and set afloat. It was engineered, planned. Its occupant had been alive, bound, and helpless when he was sealed into his floating prison. The scratches, the broken nails, the expression still frozen on the pale face. Elias shuddered. No man deserved to die like that, alone in the dark, fighting for breath that would never come. He forced himself to turn away and focus on his surroundings. The water around the boat remained eerily still. The fog had not lifted. Instead, it seemed to cling closer now, wrapping the horizon in secrecy. The world felt confined, reduced to the small circle in which Elias drifted. There was no comforting view of land, no familiar shape of the lighthouse, no reassuring lines of cliffs in the distance. Just him, the boat, and the coffin. He wiped his palms against his pants, noticing for the first time how badly his hands were shaking. It wasn't merely fear of death that unsettled him. It was the fear of not knowing what kind of danger he had stumbled into. There were things in this world people killed to protect. Elias didn't need to look inside the metal case to know it held the key to the mystery, and if he could find it, so could the ones who lost it. Those who had sealed a living man inside a coffin to keep a secret would not hesitate to do worse to anyone who interfered. He swallowed a lump of dread and approached the coffin once more, crouching beside it so he could study the metal case more closely through the small gap before the lid had been fastened again. Its surface was smooth, unmarked, almost sterile. It had been designed to be untraceable. Whatever lay inside wasn't meant to be found, but the chain of events had betrayed its owners. Elias had interfered with the logic of crime, and now that knowledge sat heavy inside him. He reached into the coffin again, hesitation slowing his movements, as though a corpse could reach out and grab his wrist, but he pushed that image away. Dead men no longer had strength. They only had stories. Silent, desperate stories carved in claw marks and chains. Carefully, he unfastened the straps that held the case in place. The metal was cold, unnaturally cold. It almost felt like it was leaching warmth from his skin, demanding a price for being touched. When he finally lifted the case free, he realized how heavy it was. Far heavier than it looked. Whatever was inside was dense, valuable, and dangerous. The weight pulled on his shoulder as he moved it across the coffin's edge and set it on the deck of his boat. It landed with a dull metallic thud, an ominous punctuation to the act of removing it from the coffin. Elias stared at it, chest rising and falling too quickly. This was no ordinary shipment. This was something worth killing for. Whoever orchestrated this floating tomb was going to be furious when they discovered it missing. And if they could track it, they'd come straight for him. He looked again at the body. The man's suit was tailored, expensive, perfectly fit to his now motionless form. A silver cufflink remained attached to one wrist where the skin had not torn. His shoes were polished, the soles barely scuffed. This wasn't a drifter or a low-level criminal. He was someone who mattered, someone with money, someone who had been betrayed by power greater than his own. It was then that Elias noticed something else. A small tattoo on the man's neck just above the collar, an emblem shaped like a crest or insignia. He couldn't clearly make out the design, but it looked official, perhaps belonging to a corporation, a government division, or a private syndicate. Something with reach. something that commanded obedience and silence. His gaze shifted again to the man's hands, still bound by chains that were bolted deep into the walls of the coffin. They were not tied for stability. They were restraints. Restraints designed to hold a man upright, to stop him from thrashing too violently in his final panic. Elias imagined the terror of waking up in such a place, the desperate realization of being trapped in a claustrophobic darkness, every scream swallowed by walls that offered no mercy. He felt a surge of anger replace his fear. Whoever had done this was more monster than man. A sudden wave hit the side of the boat harder than the others, jarring Elias back to the present. The sea was shifting beneath him, currents moving with greater force. The fog swirled in strange patterns, coiling like fingers around distant shapes. The coffin creaked. It was as if the ocean itself wanted to announce that time was running out. He needed to move. But before he could start the engine, he felt compelled to do one more thing. He reached forward and adjusted the man's head slightly, closing the slackened jaw that had fallen open in horror. Without thinking, he whispered a small prayer. Nothing formal, just a simple wish for peace the man had never been granted. It felt wrong to leave him with his face twisted in fear, even if his soul had long departed. He stood up slowly and scanned the horizon again. The fog had thinned slightly to the east, revealing a faint crease of silver light. The sun struggled to burn through the mist, but its weak presence did little to comfort him. It only lit the stage on which unknown enemies now hunted their lost possession. Elias's boat was small, his motor old and unreliable. A well-equipped pursuer would have no trouble catching him. His heartbeat quickened. He couldn't stay here. He had to get the coffin, no, the boat, moving. He had to get this metal case to shore, somewhere safe, somewhere people could help him understand what he had uncovered, or at least protect him from those who wanted it back. He cast one last look at the coffin, now fully secured. The details carved into his memory, the scratches, the ventilated panels, the instruments designed to prolong, not end, life. A cruel technology, a torture chamber crafted to be inconspicuous. The thought unsettled him deeply. He moved toward the wheel, but as he reached for the ignition, he froze. There was movement on the horizon. A shadow slipped through the thinning fog, too large to be a bird and too swift to be driftwood. At first, he convinced himself it might be another fishing vessel. But fishing boats didn't cut the water with such speed. They didn't move with predatory intent. This silhouette glided low, its engine a distant growl he could only barely make out beneath the churning waves. His pulse thundered in his ears. Someone was coming. He didn't wait for certainty. With trembling hands, he started the engine, urging it to roar to life faster than ever before. The boat shuddered and lurched forward, the motor coughing once before catching its breath and pulling them away from the scene. Elias gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he guided the boat through rolling patches of fog, each one threatening to blind him. Behind him, the shape grew clearer, sleek, dark, angular. Not a fishing boat, not Coast Guard, not rescue, a hunter. He pushed the throttle to its limit. His small vessel strained under the force, the bow lifting slightly as it cut through the waves. Spray hit his face, stinging his eyes, but he did not wipe it away. The case at his feet banged against the deck with each impact, a constant reminder of the choice he had made. The coffin remained latched to the side of the boat, its weight shifting dangerously with every swell. Elias's heart wouldn't slow. The fear that coursed through him was no longer abstract. It had shape. It had direction. It was closing in fast. He allowed himself one last glance over his shoulder. Through the fog and water spray, the pursuing vessel surged forward. Sleek metallic lines, tinted windows, and a wake-like claws tearing the sea apart. Whoever they were not coming to rescue anyone. They were coming to erase a mistake. The mistake was Elias. He faced forward again, jaw clenched, and pressed the throttle even harder, knowing the fragile engine might not withstand the strain. But he had no choice. It wasn't just a dead man, that coffin, anymore. It was a story begging to be told. It was justice demanding witness. And Elias Rowe, a simple fisherman with debts and a life too quiet to be noteworthy, now found himself holding the evidence to a crime so vile that the ocean itself seemed reluctant to carry it. The chase had begun. The engine strained beneath Elias's hands, its vibrations running up his arms and lodging in his teeth like a warning that every moment spent pushing it harder shortened its life by another hour. But there was no room left for gentle caution, no quiet reverence for an aging motor that was already past its prime. Behind him, the dark shape sliced through the mist, a predator inspired not by hunger, but by purpose. Elias did not know their names or their faces. He did not need to. The truth was written clearly enough in the speed with which they approached and the path their vessel carved through the water. They were closing in. They were searching for him. And if they found him, no one would ever know what became of Elias Rowe. Spray hit him hard across the cheeks, cold and sharp and hardly refreshing. It stung, forcing his eyes to half close as he guided his boat forward into the shifting curtains of fog. The sea no longer felt like a silent ally. It was a labyrinth, ready to twist into dead ends without warning. But the boat's familiarity brought him some small comfort. He knew its quirks more intimately than he knew most people. It coughed when pushed, but it also responded to skill. Elias trusted himself to squeeze every last ounce of speed from the vessel. The metal case at his feet clanged against the deck with every sharp wave, adding weight not only to the boat, but to the fear pressing against his ribs. The coffin, clamped and wedged into place, created drag along one side, pulling the boat slightly off balance. It would slow him down if the waves grew too strong. But he couldn't bring himself to cut it loose. Not yet. That coffin might hold answers that could explain the corpse's torment. Answers he now owed to a stranger whose final hours had been spent fighting, alone and abandoned. He could feel the boat behind him gaining ground. The engine's hum deepened into a growl, its presence now unmistakable. Guards? Criminals? Mercenaries? The questions tore through his mind, but the answers remained elusive, hidden inside the impossibly sleek silhouette pursuing him. Whatever organization had arranged that coffin, whatever secret rested inside that metal case, they would not accept failure. Elias knew the coast well. He had spent most of his life on this stretch of water, reading its tides, its dangers, its hidden paths. He could navigate even blindfolded through certain routes where rock formations lurked beneath the surface like jagged teeth, where untrained captains would never dare sail. And now he aimed for one of those places, a narrow passage framed by rising cliffs and sharp reefs, his only real advantage against a more powerful vessel. But the fog needed to cooperate, and lately it seemed more interested in hampering his vision than aiding his escape. His breath felt too shallow, not because he was running, but because the fear ballooned inside his lungs, making every inhalation seem inadequate. He forced his eyes to stay forward, to recognize landmarks through the mist. A distant, dark shape. A protrusion of rock. He nudged the wheel left, then right, listening to the rhythm of the engine and the slap of waves along the hull. All the while, the case thunked dully with the motion of the boat, the unwanted heartbeat marking the pace of his nightmare. Behind him, the pursuing vessel grew large enough to see more clearly. It was painted a matte, ominous black, built for stealth and speed. The bow cut aggressively through the water, sending twin jets of spray into the air. He thought he saw two figures at the controls. Shadows, nothing more. But their posture radiated purpose. When they saw the direction Elias had taken, they adjusted their course without hesitation. Elias's fingers tightened on the wheel. He was heading toward a covert inlet only the local fishermen used, a hidden cleft between tall rocks with a channel so narrow that larger ships rarely dared to enter. It was his best hope, yet even that came with risk. If his timing faltered by even a second, if he cut too sharply or too wide, the hull would scrape the rocky edge and split open like a tin can in the hands of fate. Then it would be over, not in a confrontation, but in a cold embrace from the depths below. The thought of drowning, lungs filling with icy water as he sank away from the sky, clawing against a force that granted no mercy. It nearly sent a tremor through him. But he clung to control. The bow of his boat rose with a swell, then dropped with a slap as the sea surged beneath him. The wind shifted, pushing fog across his field of view once more. He muttered under his breath, though not a coherent prayer or plea, just a reminder to himself that he was still alive, still moving, still fighting to carve a path away from the danger rushing toward him. The inlet entrance came into sight, a jagged wound in the coastline, the cliffs rising around it like sentinels that blocked the sun's glare. Elias guided the boat toward the dark slit, trusting that his instincts would compensate for the poor visibility. Behind him, the engine of the dark vessel roared louder, like an animal that tasted blood. His heart thudded in his chest, not from exertion, but from the memory of the man in the coffin, his pale face contorted in terror. That could be me, Elias thought, startling himself with the clarity of the image. Locked in darkness, scraping at the walls, begging for air that would not come. No one deserves such a fate. As he slipped into the inlet's shadow, everything around him grew darker. The cliffs swallowed sound and light alike. The boat slowed slightly as he reduced speed to navigate the tight turn. The waves compressed, bouncing off the stone walls and creating chaotic cross-currents. He fought to maintain control. The slightest misjudgment here would dash him against unforgiving stone. Spray filled the air. The fog moved like a living creature, twisting around the boat as if eager to hide him completely, or suffocate him. Behind him, the shadow vessel hesitated at the entrance, at least for a moment. The narrow channel forced them to slow, and their larger frame made them more vulnerable to error. Elias seized the opportunity like a gift from the sea itself. He angled the boat sharply, hugging the right-hand wall, and powered through the inlet with practiced precision. The cliffs seemed to compress around him, narrowing into a throat that spat him into a small, hidden cove, a rare sanctuary where the water lay calmer and the air smelled faintly of pine and wet rock. He killed the engine instantly. Silence swallowed him. The pursuing boat had not yet entered the channel, though he could still hear its engine idling near the entrance. They were searching. Elias drifted closer to a jut of natural stone, where shadows pooled thick and deep. He lowered his breathing, barely daring to inhale. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds. Time stretched, warped by tension. Then he heard the engine's pitch rise again. The dark vessel turned away from the inlet, not willing to risk the narrow passage. Elias's pulse finally slowed, not enough to ease the fear entirely, but enough to draw one long breath that did not taste like panic. He allowed his muscles to relax by degrees, a controlled release rather than a collapse. His hands trembled faintly, the aftermath of adrenaline still running hot through his veins. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and closed his eyes. But rest was not allowed. Not yet. The threat had not vanished, only delayed. He looked at the case once more. It sat innocently at his feet, as though it held something as mundane as fishing tools or emergency supplies. Yet, the truth was undeniable. This was the reason the man in the coffin was murdered. This was the reason strangers prowled the waters hunting for a small-time fisherman who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The weight of its presence pressed upon him like a force that threatened to crush his spirit. His gaze drifted back to the coffin. The idea of pulling the lid open again made nausea stir inside him. The image of those chains and scratches haunted him. But he needed answers. He could not return to town with something so dangerous without understanding at least a fraction of what he was carrying. He took a few slow breaths, grounding himself. Before the confrontation, before the chase, he had barely allowed himself to absorb what he had seen. The body had been more than a corpse. It had been a warning. This man had not been merely silenced. He had been erased, sealed away in an attempt to ensure that whatever secrets he knew about this case would die with him. Elias found himself whispering an apology as he knelt by the coffin again. He undid the clamps, slower this time, and lifted the lid just enough to access the interior. The dead man's face, frozen in terror and pain, greeted him once more. Elias forced himself to look closer, to search for something, anything, that might shed light on his identity. In the inner breast pocket of the suit, he found a small laminated identification card. Sleek. Government-issued, perhaps. The text was difficult to read in the dim cove light, but it contained what looked like an official seal. Not a country he recognized immediately. Something international. Something clandestine. The last piece of humanity he could offer was a gentle lowering of the lid, sealing the man's face from the world once again. Elias hesitated this time before fastening the clamps. Though the body would not move, he felt a responsibility to preserve the dignity of the dead. He had no words to comfort the man, but the gesture mattered. To him, if not to the universe. He returned to his seat, smoothing his wet palms against his thighs. The engine was silent now. Outside the cove, the water remained deceptively calm. Yet the storm had already found him, just not in wind or lightning. It lurked instead in the shape of a boat that would no doubt circle back eventually, drawn like bloodhounds to what they had lost. He lifted the metal case and placed it carefully into a weathered storage compartment beneath the deck, covering it with a tarp and an assortment of fishing gear. The movements were steady and deliberate. The case disappeared into the heart of the boat like a secret sealing itself away, but not forgotten. Never forgotten. Elias sat upright again, forcing his mind to focus. The cliffs around him shielded him from sight temporarily, but they also limited his paths forward. The cove was not a place he could linger, not if he intended to survive. He needed to slip away unnoticed, use the coastline as cover, and return to the harbor before nightfall, before those men could widen their search. He stared at the narrow entrance, the water beyond it glowing faintly where the sun fought through the fog. He did not know whether he was making the right decisions. He was alone in this. alone with death and danger and a mystery that had turned a quiet morning into a battle for survival. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Going back to life as he had known it, simple, anonymous, was no longer an option. He had crossed a threshold the moment he opened that coffin. What he carried demanded answers, justice, perhaps even vengeance. So he steadied himself once more, adjusting his grip on the wheel. The boat trembled with anticipation as his finger hovered above the ignition switch. Once the engine roared to life again, there would be no turning back. Elias Rowe had become a marked man, and those who marked him were still out there, relentless in their pursuit. He turned the key. The motor growled softly at first, then steadied. The boat began to move, its bow cutting into the open sea as sunlight finally began to burn through the fog. The cliffs receded behind him, his temporary sanctuary fading into memory. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and a path choked with questions. But Elias moved forward anyway, determination filling the void where fear had tried to take root. Whatever this was, whatever had begun with that floating coffin, it was now his burden to carry, and he would carry it through storm and shadow until the truth surfaced at last. Elias guided his boat away from the secret cove with the same care a man might take when tiptoeing past a sleeping predator. Though the cliffs had shielded him temporarily, he understood all too well that safety was only an illusion. The enemy vessel still prowled somewhere in the mist behind him, its dark hull cutting silently through the water like a shark's fin hidden beneath the surface. He could no longer hear its engine, but that absence only made the moment more unsettling. Silence, after all, meant opportunity, for them, not for him. The sea remained eerily calm. The fog continued its stubborn refusal to lift, clinging to Elias as if trying to pull him under its ghostly shroud. The world around him felt tight, enclosed, as though the horizon had shrunk to a cage designed specifically to trap him. He adjusted the throttle so his motor's rumble softened to a whisper, just enough to propel him forward while still giving him a chance to listen for sounds that did not belong to nature. Every splash of water, every creak of the boat's shifting wood, every faint call of a distant bird drew immediate attention. It was a strange thing, the way awareness could sharpen in the face of danger. Elias felt his senses expand well beyond their normal limits, turning each insignificant noise into a potential threat. With one hand on the wheel, he glanced down at the metal case secured beneath the tarp near his feet. It seemed so innocuous now, hidden beneath nets and gear. Someone passing by might think it contained nothing more than spare tools or a box of hooks and sinkers, but Elias knew the truth, that the case was the anchor dragging danger behind him. The weight of responsibility settled heavily into his bones. He had chosen this. Not in words, not even in clear intent, but by touching the coffin, by lifting the lid, by taking the case, by trying to make sense of the horror he had found. There was no going back to ignorance. Fate had locked itself onto him like the chains around the dead man's wrists. The channels between the cliffs gradually widened, leading him toward a strip of coastline he recognized. Rocky sands, seaweed-strewn shallows, and twisted trees clinging to the land like desperate hands. The fog thinned in patches, allowing short glimpses of distant shapes before swallowing them again. Elias remained silent, letting instinct guide him forward, his thoughts swirling like the mist around him. He needed to think ahead, to understand what lay waiting the moment he returned to town. Whatever was unfolding beneath the surface of this strange day would not end simply because he reached the harbor. That black boat would not give up. They would search. They would ask questions. They would threaten. They would kill if they had to, if he allowed the case to fall into the wrong hands. He pressed his tongue to the back of his teeth, frustration simmering through him. He was a fisherman, not a soldier, not a spy. Yet here he was navigating a situation that demanded strength, sharp judgment, and courage he hadn't known he possessed. His grip tightened around the wheel. Courage wasn't something a man declared. It was something he discovered when there was no other path but forward. The fog swirled suddenly, and a sound cut through the quiet, deep, low, and unmistakable. The engine. His heartbeat surged. He turned his head sharply, searching the mist for the predator that stalked him. At first, he saw nothing. Ghostly waves. The faint shadow of cliffs. But then, a darker smear in the fog moved with intent. Straight toward him. They had found him. The dark vessel arrowed through the water, its bow lifting slightly as it picked up speed. Elias couldn't afford to stay silent any longer. He pushed the throttle forward, and the boat jolted into faster motion. The small engine protested, groaning under the pressure, but it obeyed. Elias kept one hand on the wheel and another near the tarp, in case he needed to grab the case and dive overboard. It was a plan of desperation, not bravery, but desperation often kept men alive longer than valor. The hunter's boat surged closer, breaking through fog banks with ruthless determination. The sleek lines of its hull became visible, the polished darkness reflecting streaks of sunlight that finally began to break through the veil overhead. Elias noticed markings on the side, symbols he didn't recognize, painted in a subdued shade that suggested secrecy rather than pride. Not pirates. Not smugglers. Something far more organized. He leaned into the wheel and turned sharply, guiding his boat into a stretch of shallow water. The hull scraped slightly, the vibration rattling his bones. This route was perilous. Reefs lay hidden beneath the waves, jagged and merciless. If he misjudged their placement, the bottom of his boat would tear open like paper, and he'd have a different kind of fate to face. But the other boat wouldn't dare follow. They didn't know these waters. They didn't speak the language of the rocks. Elias did. For a few exhilarating seconds, he gained distance. The enemy vessel slowed briefly, its driver reconsidering the pursuit path. Elias exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but he knew this reprieve wouldn't last. The predators weren't frightened by a few stones or unfamiliar terrain. They would find another way. He needed something more. Somewhere to hide not just for a few minutes, but long enough to plan. The coastline shifted as he passed the last of the inward jutting cliffs. Ahead, he saw the outline of an old abandoned lighthouse, its paint peeling, its windows shattered, a relic from a time when more sailors needed guidance to survive these waters. A concrete dock extended from its base, partially collapsed and slick with algae. It hadn't been used by the town for years. Too isolated, too dangerous when storms hit. But for Elias, isolation was exactly what he needed. He cut the engine and let momentum carry him towards the dock. The boat coasted shakily, bumping against the worn structure with a hollow thud. Elias grabbed a rope and tied the vessel to a rusted cleat, moving quickly, his breath sharp with adrenaline. The case remained hidden beneath the tarp. He grabbed it now, holding the weight close to his chest. It was heavy enough to slow him if he needed to run, but leaving it behind was not an option. Whoever controlled that case controlled the narrative of this nightmare. He jumped onto the dock. His boot slipped slightly on wet algae, but he caught himself using the rough edge of a fallen beam for balance. The fog thinned further here, revealing tall grass swaying beyond the lighthouse and a path leading inland. The structure loomed overhead like a watchtower built to observe secrets rather than ships. Its metal door hung open on a single hinge, rusted and jerking slightly as the breeze caught it. He ducked inside. The air was stale. Dust clung to broken glass scattered across the floor. The circular walls bore scars where equipment once hung. A spiral staircase wound upward into darkness. Elias moved cautiously, listening for any sign that the hunters had followed on foot. Nothing yet. That silence felt almost as threatening as the engine had been seconds earlier. He ascended the stairs with careful steps, making sure the case remained tightly against his grip. The top floor offered a clearer vantage point. Windows overlooked the shallows and the stretch of water he had crossed moments before. Elias crouched near one, peering out. The dark boat idled at the edge of the danger zone. He saw figures blurred in the distance, scanning the coastline. One pointed in his direction. A chill crawled up his spine. They had seen him. Not clearly, not yet. But his time was shrinking. Every heartbeat seemed louder in his ears. He turned away from the window and set the case down on what remained of a metal console. The clank echoed, bouncing off the curved stone walls like a warning bell. He flinched, waiting for footsteps or voices outside. Still nothing. They were biding their time. He ran his hand across the surface of the case. The cold metal reminded him exactly why he was here, not hiding from his own mistakes, but from the cruelty of men far worse. The dead man's face flashed again in his mind, those terrified eyes, the final, desperate scraping against a doomed imprisonment. Elias felt anger swelling in him again, an anger unlike his usual quiet frustrations with debt or labor. This anger was righteous, fueled by the knowledge that someone had inflicted indescribable suffering to protect whatever lay inside this case, that they had denied not only life, but dignity. Such people did not stop when obstacles appeared, they simply removed the obstacles. He inhaled deeply, tasting dust and salt in equal measure, and slowly opened the case. Once again, the breath left his lungs in a jolt of shock. The interior was meticulously organized. Stacks of documents sealed in waterproof sleeves, each stamped with official insignias and security markings. Digital drives nestled into shock-proof molds. A sleek black device that looked like a secure satellite phone. And money. Bands of crisp bills in multiple currencies, enough to buy silence, influence, loyalty, or betrayal. Elias traced the crest stamped onto the largest folder inside. He didn't recognize it, but its design, sharp lines intersecting within an unbroken circle, hinted at authority and secrecy. Government. Or worse, private power that operated above government. The man in the coffin had been carrying proof. Proof that someone in a high seat was dirty. Proof meant to reach someone trustworthy before it was too late. But someone else had learned of his mission. Someone terrifyingly powerful, and now Elias was holding the evidence of that conspiracy. He pressed the lid closed. He didn't dare read more, not now. Information was fuel for panic, and panic would kill him faster than bullets. He needed to move again, to stay one step ahead of the hunt. Voices cut through the wind below the lighthouse. Elias stiffened. Male voices. Firm. Organized. They were here. His mind raced. There was no back exit, no easy escape. The only way out was the way he came in, a straight line into the sights of the man below. He crept back toward the staircase, careful not to let the wood groan under his weight. The case felt heavier with every step he took. Perhaps it wasn't the case, but the danger it carried that weighed him down. Through a crack in the wall, he saw shapes moving around his boat. 2 men, dressed in dark gear, one holding what looked like a long rifle or harpoon gun. Not fishermen, not locals, professionals. Cold efficiency in their posture, the kind of men who acted without hesitation. He held his breath as they scanned the dock, their footsteps hollow against the wooden planks. Another figure remained in the boat, hand on the throttle, engine still rumbling, ready for immediate flight. They were expecting to find him quickly. Kill, retrieve the case, leave before questions were raised. Elias retreated deeper into the lighthouse, back pressed to the wall, breath shallow. He thought briefly of fighting back, of taking a stand like the characters in the movies he sometimes watched alone late at night. But those were fantasies. In real life, courage without strategy was suicide. His only strength lay in what the sea had taught him: patience and survival. The men outside spoke in low tones, then split up. One walked toward the lighthouse door. Elias could hear his boots scraping the concrete as he stepped over the threshold. Dust crunched beneath each footfall. The case was still clutched in Elias's hands, useless as a weapon, but too valuable to abandon. He backed slowly toward the staircase again, the old railing cold against his side. The intruder paused, listening. Elias could feel the man's attention, like a force seeking to pierce the wall between them. One more step, Elias thought, and I am done. A sudden blast of wind slammed the broken door hard against the outer wall. The noise echoed through the lighthouse like thunder. The intruder swore quietly, instinctively turning back to secure the door. A heartbeat later, the voice of the boat captain called out urgently. Perhaps they had spotted something suspicious on the shoreline farther down. The intruder hesitated only a moment before turning and heading back to the dock. Elias didn't dare move until the footsteps faded. Only then did he exhale, his knees nearly given out beneath him. He slid down against the wall and allowed his head to fall back. His breath quivered with relief and dread. He was alive by a thread. He remained still for quite some time, mind racing chaotically, thoughts firing too fast to separate. He understood one thing clearly now. If he didn't take this case to someone who could protect him and expose the truth, these men would hunt him forever. And if they caught him, he would die alone and terrified, just like the man in the coffin. He pushed himself upright again. His fear was still there, but something else had begun to take shape inside him, a resolve forged in pressure. He would not let the dead man's suffering be erased. He would not let those chains have the final word. He crept down the lighthouse stairs, the case secure in his grip. Outside, the men had moved farther along the shore, scanning the ground. The black vessel remained at the ready, prowling like a caged beast. Elias slipped around the opposite side of the lighthouse, where dense reeds and low trees created natural cover. He stayed low, running in the slow crouched movements toward the inland path. The moment he reached the shade of the trees, he paused only once to look back. The hunters were growing impatient. One kicked at the side of Elias's boat, frustrated. But frustration made men sloppy, and sloppiness was a gift Elias intended to take full advantage of. Without another glance, he disappeared into the landscape, the lighthouse fading behind him. He carried death's secret in his hands, and with every step forward, he walked farther into a war he did not understand, but would see through. For Elias Rowe was no longer merely running from danger. He was running toward the truth. The inland path twisted like a serpent through overgrown brush. a narrow ribbon of dirt that had once been tread by lighthouse keepers and occasional hikers, though no one had likely used it for years. Elias pressed forward, ducking beneath low, gnarled branches that clawed at his jacket and obscured his view of the sky. Every few steps, he paused and listened. His heartbeat thudded too loudly in his ears, threatening to drown out the real dangers that lurked behind him. He tasted metal in the back of his throat, a crude reminder of the nearness of death. He couldn't be sure whether the hunters had seen him slip away or if they still believed he was hiding somewhere within the lighthouse. Either way, he knew better than to assume he was safe. The case weighed heavily in his grasp, cold metal edges pressing into his fingers. It wasn't simply the physical burden that exhausted him, it was the knowledge of what that rectangular container represented. He carried more than objects or paper. He carried answers to a murder, evidence of a monstrous conspiracy, and with it, responsibility that threatened to crush him with every step. Elias had never been a man who stood at the center of conflict. He'd always worked to remain silent, unnoticed, letting larger problems pass him by like storms that struck only the highest peaks. But now the thunder had come down into the valley, and he was caught directly in its path. He climbed a gentle rise, the ground soft and shifting with damp soil. When he crested the top of the slope, he saw the familiar outline of the town below. Buildings gathered in clusters along the waterfront, their roofs forming a jagged mosaic of rusted tin and chipped paint. The fish processing plant stood closest to the pier, a hulking structure that sucked in the daily catch and spat out the stench of ammonia and seawater. A few fishing boats were already returning from morning voyages, their silhouettes bobbing against the muted gray horizon. Farther inland stretched a patchwork of tired homes and dusty streets that led to a modest town square. Just a handful of shops, a bar, and the post office. From this height, the town seemed shrunken, fragile, a place where people were too preoccupied with daily survival to imagine shadows creeping in from the sea. A place that might not believe him if he told them the truth. Yet it was also the only place where help could come from. If he did nothing, he would be hunted forever. If he chose wrong, his life would end quietly and cruelly. He needed to make the right move. He needed someone he could trust. Elias scanned the town, searching for a face that might stand as ally rather than threat. Few people in his life met that description. He had always walked alone, but some were at least predictable. The harbor master, old Daniels, knew the waters too well to be easily intimidated. Sheriff Alden, while not exactly a friend, believed in rules. Strange events out at sea would get his attention. And then there was Marla from the bar, one of the rare souls who didn't judge Elias for his origins. She had always served him with a quiet respect that felt genuine. Perhaps she could help him find someone who would listen. A rustling noise snapped Elias out of thought. He crouched low and tightened his grip around the case, peering into the brush behind him. The wind hissed through the tall grass, but beyond the natural murmur of leaves, he thought he heard a snap, like a twig breaking beneath a boot. His pulse spiked. He shifted his stance, preparing to run again, when a crow burst from a nearby tree, cawing wildly as it took flight. The sudden movement startled him so badly he nearly dropped the case. He cursed beneath his breath and exhaled shakily, realizing he was only a few anxious thoughts away from losing his mind entirely. But whether footsteps or crow, the warning was clear. He could not linger here. He adjusted the strap of the case over his shoulder and began to descend the hill toward the back edge of town, where overgrown lots and unused storage sheds offered minimal cover. Each step closer brought him nearer to civilization, yet the danger did not relent. If anything, it grew heavier, because now he was approaching places where ordinary people could get involved. His burden was not only his own. If he made one mistake, if the hunters followed him here, the risk would spill into the streets like blood into water. He reached the edge of town, emerging from the brush behind the old boat repair yard. The smell of diesel and varnish overwhelmed the earthier sense of grass and soil. Elias kept low, moving between stacks of decaying wooden pallets and rusted machinery parts. There were voices on the far side of the storage yard, dock workers starting their morning shifts, unaware of the chaos drifting toward them on the fog. He slipped from the yard and entered the narrow alley that connected to the backside of the bar. The building was still closed, though a couple of delivery trucks idled nearby. Marla would be inside prepping for the midday crowd. Elias could picture her wiping down the counter with a worn rag, humming softly to whatever old jazz record played from her dusty stereo system. He considered knocking on the back door, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Marla didn't deserve to have this terror forced into her life, and Elias couldn't bear to see confusion or fear in her eyes if he showed up unannounced, dragging death behind him. He continued onward, hugging the walls as he crossed from the alley into the shopping street. The eyes of the town watched him now, from behind windows, from open doors, from the seats of parked cars. Or perhaps that was just his imagination, distorted by fear that seemed larger than reason. To them, he was just Elias the fisherman, nothing more, a man with a quiet routine who rarely drew attention, but today he strode with something foreign hanging in his posture, urgency mixed with a trembling dread that he struggled to suppress. He turned down Harbor Street, headed toward the sheriff's office. If anyone had the authority to act without hesitation, it was Sheriff Alden. The man was stoic to a fault, his sense of justice locked into rigid black and white thinking. But maybe this time the simplicity of his worldview would work in Elias's favor. A body locked in a coffin, chained like a prisoner. That was no gray area. But as he reached the edge of the town square, something caught his eye, a glint of sunlight hitting polished metal. A black sedan, sleek and unfamiliar, sat idling across from the sheriff's office. Its tinted windows kept its occupants hidden. Elias's breath hitched painfully. That wasn't the kind of car this town saw often, and certainly not driven by locals. His heart dropped like an anchor. They were here already. He retreated back into the cover of an old laundromat doorway, gripping the case close to his body. He peered out, cautious, careful. The sedan's passenger side door opened. A tall man stepped out, his posture radiating unchecked confidence. His black suit blended seamlessly with the car, his hair slicked neatly into place. He looked like a corporate executive, except his movements were too smooth, too calculated. This was a predator in a civilized disguise. The man scanned the area with an expression that made Elias's blood turn cold. He walked with purpose toward the sheriff's office. Elias understood instantly what that meant. The hunters were covering all exits. If they convinced Sheriff Alden that Elias was a thief, a suspect, or worse, if they claimed authority and manipulated the law to act against him, then Elias would be caught in a net he could not escape. They would silence him legally, or illegally once no one was looking. And the truth would die again, just as it had in that floating coffin. Panic surged through him, but not the kind that paralyzed. This panic turned into resolve. He had to protect the information. He had to protect himself. He stepped away from the doorway and hurried toward an older part of town. toward the sheds near the docks where people rarely walked unless necessary. He could hide there temporarily, long enough to regroup and choose a better ally. The Coast Guard outpost was farther along the shore. They might respond faster to a maritime crime than a local sheriff. He needed time, just a little more time. He reached the outermost storage shed, heart pounding fiercely. The building's door hung crookedly, but it was locked. Elias found a loose board near the foundation and forced it aside, slipping beneath the splintered wood. Inside, damp air filled his lungs, the scent of mildew stronger than anything else. Old lobster traps and cracked crates lay scattered around in disarray. He knelt behind a stack of them and set the case down with a muffled thud, pressing his back to the wall. Silence settled in after his heavy breaths tapered into shallow whispers. His fingers trembled uncontrollably, but he clasped them together, forcing stillness. He needed his mind clear, needed to think strategically. Fear screamed at him that he was doomed, but another voice, a steadier one, insisted that the mere fact he was still alive meant fortune had not abandoned him yet. With a deep exhale, he reached again for the case and opened it. This time, he did not allow his eyes to skim past what lay inside. He studied every detail, forcing his mind to absorb information that might save him. The documents weren't random. Each had been categorized with precise care. Names, dates, offshore transactions, contracts marked with a crest he recognized now from the dead man's tattoo, an emblem belonging to an international security contractor he'd heard mentioned only in whispers on the news. A company that operated in crises and war zones, behind government authorization but beyond public oversight. Men without conscience. Men whose power came from silence. The drives held digital records, encrypted files, likely enough to reveal the rotten core beneath a polished corporate shield. Elias didn't understand the finer details, but the magnitude was unmistakable. This case was evidence of criminal corruption so deep that someone had decided the truth must be buried, literally. The man in the coffin had been a whistleblower, a spy against his own employers. He had attempted to escape with proof. They had caught him before he reached land, sealing him into that coffin like trash to be thrown into the sea. Elias stared at the case's contents until his vision blurred. The enormity of what he held crept into his soul like an invading tide. This was not a battle meant for a fisherman. This was a fight above governments and treaties, enforced with bullets and money. He was no hero, no warrior. He was just a man with a boat and a conscience that refused to look away from the truth. If he ran now, if he left the case, or threw it into the ocean, it would all begin again. Another innocent person would die, another coffin would float, another truth would drown. Elias closed the case and locked it. He wiped sweat from his brow, though his hands still trembled. He looked at the shed door, listening again. Distant engines, muffled voices, every sound hinted at discovery. He could not stay here long, but for one moment he allowed himself to sit, muscles aching from tension he had held for hours. His thoughts drifted briefly to the dead man. Elias's jaw tensed. That man had fought, scraping, clawing, screaming until his last breath. He had died alone in terror, but not without courage. He had died so that the truth might one day reach someone who could carry it the rest of the way. That someone was now Elias. A fisherman who had only wanted to catch enough fish to pay his debt now held the power to expose a great evil. It wasn't a calling he had chosen, but it was the one that had chosen him. Outside, a voice barked orders. Boots struck pavement. Elias's spine straightened like a drawn bowstring. He slid the case's strap over his shoulder again. The time for rest was over. He pushed himself to his feet and prepared to run once more, because the dead man's fight wasn't finished. Not yet. Elias slipped out of the shed's shadows like a ghost, the heavy metal case clutched close to his chest. He kept low, mindful of the footsteps and voices growing nearer. The hunters were spreading through the docks now, methodical and determined, the precise kind of men who left no corner unchecked. His instincts sharpened under pressure, telling him it was only a matter of time before they found his tracks. Fear did not consume him the way it had earlier. It had transformed into something colder, something that resembled purpose. He darted between stacks of crates, using each moment of cover to assess his next move. In the distance, the familiar sound of a foghorn wailed from the harbor entrance. Boats returning from the morning catch were pulling into the pier, their silhouettes emerging from the thinning mist. Fishermen laughed with easy camaraderie as they hauled their nets on board, unaware that death wore shoes only yards away. For the first time since the chase began, Elias realized he wasn't alone in his peril. If he made the wrong move, he wouldn't be the only victim. The wind shifted, carrying the low rumble of the black sedan's engine from the town square. The hunters had mobilized on land, too. He pressed himself against a cold metal container, pulse quickening at the sight of two figures moving steadily along Harbor Street. Their posture radiated a coiled violence, ready to strike at even the faintest sign of trouble. He scanned the scene with growing urgency. The sheriff's office was blocked, the bar offered no safety, and the repair yard was too exposed. That left only one real option: the Coast Guard station. A squat white building perched near the waterline, its flag fluttering half-heartedly in the breeze. Trained personnel, radios, access to federal channels. If anyone could bring this nightmare into the light before he vanished beneath the waves like the man in the coffin, it would be them. But reaching the station required crossing open ground. A straight sprint with nowhere to hide. Every instinct pushed against the idea. Running into visibility while men with weapons prowled the docks was madness. Yet, staying where he was meant certain capture. He felt the weight of the case shift painfully against his shoulder and drew a slow breath, knowing he had to gamble his life on his courage. The fog finally began to retreat fully, revealing the blue-gray stretch of water beside the pier. A gull screeched overhead, wings flashing white against the morning light. Elias used the distraction. He broke from his hiding place, his boots hitting the wooden planks of the pier with sharp, echoing thuds. He ran. Shouts pierced the air behind him. He didn't dare look back. The wind lashed his face as he sprinted past confused fishermen who turned their heads too slowly to understand what was happening. His lungs burned, but his legs pushed harder, propelled by a primal need to survive. 50 yards, 40, 30. The Coast Guard station loomed closer, salvation within reach. A figure stepped into his path. Elias skidded, nearly losing his footing. The man was tall, wearing a dark jacket and mirrored sunglasses that hid expression entirely. He stood too still to be ordinary, his posture like a closed steel trap. Elias veered sharply, trying to rush around him, but the man caught sight of the case and moved with sudden, lethal speed. A hand shot out, grabbing Elias by the arm. Pain flared up his shoulder. "Stop!" The command was low and calm, but it hit Elias like a blade to the spine. He twisted hard, breaking free by sheer desperation, and staggered forward. The man didn't chase immediately. He spoke into a concealed microphone, voice clipped and professional. Elias heard the word package and felt his heart slam against his ribs. He wasn't a person to them. He was a delivery gone wrong. 2 Coast Guard officers had stepped outside at the sound of running. Their confusion dissolved into alarm as they noticed Elias's frantic state and the strangers closing in from the pier. One officer reached for Elias's arm, thinking he was merely a distressed civilian. "Help!" Elias gasped, breath ragged. "You don't know what's happening. They'll kill me." The taller of the 2 officers frowned, torn between instinct to assist and suspicion that perhaps Elias was the dangerous one here. But the hesitation vanished when 3 men in dark suits suddenly appeared at the dock's edge, their hands slipping beneath their jackets where weapons were surely concealed. "Inside," the officer barked. Elias stumbled toward the door, clutching the case like a lifeline. The Coast Guard slammed the door shut behind him just as the hunters reached the station exterior. Through the small window, Elias saw them fan out like wolves surrounding a barricaded cabin. One knocked politely on the glass as though this were a simple misunderstanding. The officer pulled thick blinds down in response. Elias sagged against the wall, his body a trembling mess. For the first time since dawn broke, there was something like safety between him and danger, but safety was not certainty. The officer studied him. Elias could see questions forming, too many to answer quickly. He inhaled deeply, trying to assemble words that could explain the impossible. "I found a coffin," he said quietly, voice unsteady. "Out on the water. Inside was a man. Chained. Alive when he was put there. There was this case." He placed the container on a metal table. His hands remained on it, unwilling to let go. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by a heavy knock that rattled the reinforced door. A voice from outside, too smooth and too controlled, requested cooperation from federal contractors pursuing a dangerous fugitive. A dangerous fugitive. Elias swallowed hard. They were trying to reverse the narrative, turn him into the threat. And for anyone who didn't know the truth, their uniforms and composure might be convincing. The ranking officer motioned for silence and stepped away to speak into a radio. Elias watched, unable to read his expression. Would he believe a simple fisherman over well-dressed professionals with forged credentials and lies rehearsed to perfection? Seconds stretched painfully long. The case sat between them like a beating heart, keeping time with the tension in the room. Finally, the officer returned. His jaw was set, not in fear, but resolve. "Let's see it," he said. Elias opened the case. The documents, the drives, the money, laid bare under fluorescent lights. The officers leaned in, scanning seals and stamps and foreign markings. Their expressions darkened as they realized the importance and danger of what they were seeing. "This is high-level intelligence," one murmured. "International operations." His partner nodded grimly. "No way those men outside are who they claim to be." The knock at the door came again, longer, more forceful. The officer closest to Elias reached for his holster. "Rowe," the ranking officer said, "you did the right thing bringing this here." Relief nearly buckled Elias's knees, but the moment shattered when the window pane cracked from an impact. Someone outside tried to force entry. The officers reacted instantly. One braced the door while the other moved Elias toward the back exit. "We're getting you to the main harbor," the officer urged. "There's a secure patrol vessel there. Radio calls are already going out. Reinforcements inbound." Reinforcements. For the first time, the scale of the danger shifted in Elias's mind. He was no longer fleeing in silence. The threat he carried had a voice now, a network of eyes and ears. The conspiracy would not survive in the dark forever, not if he made it through the next few minutes alive. Gunfire erupted outside. The officers tensed, exchanging quick hand signals before guiding Elias through a narrow service door. The alley beyond smelled of salt and oil. Elias clutched the case tight and ran alongside them through the maze of supply crates and equipment. The harbor expanded before them, boats, steel railings, and waves slapping the dock in a frantic rhythm. The patrol vessel sat ready, engines primed, crew alerted. Safety was a dozen strides away. A sharp crack split the air. The officer directly behind Elias collapsed without a sound, blood staining the boards beneath him. The remaining officer shoved Elias forward. "Don't stop! Go!" Elias stumbled, horror ripping through him. He did not know this man, not really, but his sacrifice seared itself into Elias's soul. Death had followed him from the moment he touched that coffin, and it continued to spread like oil on water. He vaulted over the patrol boat's railing just as bullets sparked against the metal hull. A crewman pulled him deeper inside. Engines roared, and the vessel tore away from the dock in a violent burst of speed. The case slid across the deck, but Elias caught it before it could fly overboard. The hunters' voices grew faint behind him, swallowed by distance and the roar of turbines. Elias collapsed onto the floor, lungs heaving. He stared up at the sky, now bright and cloudless. The fog had finally lifted entirely, revealing everything the ocean had been hiding. The dead man, the case, the truth. The officer who survived knelt beside him, face hardened by duty but softened by concern. "You're safe for now. We'll take you somewhere secure. You'll give your statement. This information will get to the right people." Elias nodded, though his words stuck in his throat. Safe for now. He clutched the case closer still. His arms ached from how tightly he held it, but letting go felt like betrayal, of the man who clawed at a coffin lid in his final moments, of the officer who died protecting him, of himself. He turned his gaze toward the horizon. Sunlight glittered across the waves, turning them into shifting mirrors of silver and blue. The same sea that had tried to deliver death to him now carried him toward life, toward justice. He had not asked to become part of this story, but he knew now, in a way that left no room for doubt, that he was no longer an accidental witness. He was the sole guardian of truth that men had killed to bury. He thought of the dead man again, his silent plea carved into wood. Elias bowed his head slightly, as though returning a promise. A promise that the terror that man endured would not be forgotten, that the evil that chained him would be exposed. His life had changed course forever, and there was no turning back. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, imagine what's coming next. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the truth hiding beneath the surface. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you found that coffin? Share this video with your friends and family. Someone else needs to see what was discovered out there. Stay with us. The next story might be even more shocking.